Chapter 7. Concerning new principalities which are acquired either by the arms of others or by good fortune. Private citizens who become princes entirely through fortune have an easy time rising, but a very hard time staying on top. They face no hurdles on the way up because they practically fly. The real difficulties hit them once they reach the summit. This happens to people who buy a state or receive it as a favor. Think of the many princes Darius installed in Greece, across the cities of Ionia and the Hellespont. He made them rulers simply to hold those cities for his own security and glory. The same goes for the Roman emperors who went from common citizens to rulers by bribing the military. These leaders rely entirely on the goodwill and the fortune of whoever put them in power. Both of those things are incredibly unstable and unreliable. Such rulers also lack the knowledge needed for the job. Unless they are men of immense ability and virtue, you cannot expect someone who has only ever lived as a private citizen to know how to command. Furthermore, they cannot hold on to power because they do not have loyal and friendly armies of their own. States that emerge overnight are just like anything else in nature that grows too fast. They simply cannot develop the deep roots and strong foundations needed to survive the first political storm. They will be overthrown. The only exception is if these unexpected princes have so much virtue that they instantly figure out how to defend what fortune had just tossed into their laps. They must quickly build the foundations after taking power, rather than building them beforehand like everyone else. Let me give you two examples from recent memory about these two ways of becoming a prince, either by virtù or by fortuna. The examples are Francesco Sforza and Cesare Borgia. Francesco used the right methods and immense virtù to rise from a private citizen to the Duke of Milan. Because he pushed through 1,000 anxieties to get that power, he held on to it with very little trouble. On the other hand, Cesare Borgia, who the people called Duke Valentino, acquired his state through the political rise of his father, Pope Alexander VI. When his father's power declined, Cesare lost his state. He lost it despite doing absolutely everything a wise and capable man should do. He took every possible measure to plant strong roots in the territories that the weapons and fortuna of others had handed to him. As I mentioned earlier, if you do not lay your foundations first, a man of incredible virtù might still manage to lay them later. However, doing so is extremely difficult for the architect and dangerous for the entire building. If you look at every step Cesare Borgia took, you will see that he built solid foundations for his future power. I do not think it is a waste of time to discuss them. In fact, I do not know any better advice to give a new prince than the example of Borgia's actions. If his plans eventually failed, it was not his fault. He was simply crushed by the extraordinary and extreme malice of fortuna. When Pope Alexander VI wanted to make his son, the Duke, powerful, he faced many immediate and future problems. First, he saw no way to give his son a state unless it belonged to the church. But if he tried to steal from the church, he knew the Duke of Milan and the Venetians would stop him. Faenza and Rimini were already under Venetian protection. On top of this, the military forces of Italy that he could have used were controlled by men who feared a powerful pope. Specifically, the Orsini family, the Colonna family, and their followers held all the military cards. Therefore, the Pope had to completely flip the board. He needed to throw the Italian powers into chaos so he could safely grab a piece of their territories. This turned out to be easy. He saw that the Venetians, for their own reasons, were already planning to bring the French back into Italy. The Pope did not try to stop this. Instead, he made it easier by officially dissolving the previous marriage of King Louis of France. So, King Louis marched into Italy with Venetian help and the Pope's blessing. As soon as the king reached Milan, the Pope borrowed French soldiers to attack the Romagna region. The Romagna quickly surrendered out of fear of the French king's reputation. At this point, Cesare Borgia had conquered the Romagna and crushed the Colonna family. He wanted to secure his new land and conquer even more, but two things stood in his way. First, his own army did not seem loyal. Second, he could not trust the goodwill of France. Borgia was relying on mercenary troops from the Orsini family, and he worried they would abandon him. He feared they would not only stop him from conquering more, but actually steal what he had already won. He worried the French king might do exactly the same thing. Borgia got a warning about the Orsini troops when he attacked Bologna after taking Faenza. He noticed the Orsini mercenaries marched into battle with extreme reluctance. As for the French king, Borgia learned his true intentions right after conquering the Duchy of Urbino. When Borgia launched an attack on Tuscany, the king forced him to stop. Right then and there, the duke decided to never again rely on the weapons or the fortuna of other men. The first thing he did was weaken the Orsini and Colonna factions in Rome. He did this by poaching all their noble followers. He made these nobles his own men, gave them excellent pay, and honored them with high offices and commands based on their rank. Within a few months, their old loyalty to their factions completely vanished, replaced by total devotion to the duke. After successfully scattering the Colonna family's followers, Borgia waited patiently for a chance to crush the Orsini family. That opportunity came quickly, and he played it perfectly. The Orsini finally realized that the growing power of the duke and the church would mean their ultimate ruin. They called a secret meeting at Magione in Perugia. This meeting sparked a rebellion in Urbino, riots in the Romagna, and endless dangers for the duke. He managed to crush all these threats with the help of the French. But once his authority was restored, he refused to risk everything by relying on the French or any other outside army again. Instead, he turned to deception. Borgia was a master at hiding his true intentions. He used Signor Pagolo to broker a peace with the Orsini. The duke showered Pagolo with money, fine clothes, and horses to win his trust. The Orsini were foolishly convinced by this performance and agreed to a reconciliation. Their gullibility led them right into Borgia's trap at Sinigalia. The duke ruthlessly exterminated the Orsini leaders and turned their surviving followers into his own loyal allies. By doing this, Borgia built incredibly strong foundations for his power. He now controlled the entire Romagna and the Duchy of Urbino. Even better, the local people started to taste the prosperity he brought them, and they completely rallied to his side. Because this specific strategy is brilliant and should be copied by others, I must explain exactly how he did it. When the duke first took over the Romagna, he found it had been governed by weak, pathetic lords. These lords had robbed their subjects instead of ruling them. They caused division rather than unity, leaving the entire region overrun with theft, gang violence, and lawlessness. Borgia knew that to bring peace and enforce obedience, he needed to install a brutal, effective governor. So, he gave absolute power to Ramiro d'Orco, a swift and famously cruel man. In a very short time, Ramiro crushed the criminals and restored complete peace and unity, gaining massive success. But then the duke realized that giving someone such absolute, brutal authority was becoming dangerous. He knew the people were starting to hate Ramiro's extreme methods, and that hatred could blow back on him. To fix this, Borgia established a civil court in the center of the province, led by an excellent judge, where every city had its own lawyer. The duke knew the recent violence had sparked some resentment toward himself. He wanted to clear his name, wipe away the anger, and win the people over entirely. He needed to prove that any cruelty that had happened was not his fault, but simply the vicious nature of his minister. He used this as an excuse to act. One morning in the public square at Cesena, Borgia had Ramiro chopped in half. He left the bloody corpse in the piazza with a wooden chopping block and a bloody knife right beside it. The sheer barbaric shock of this gruesome spectacle left the people simultaneously satisfied and completely terrified. But let us get back to the main point. The duke was now highly powerful. He had secured himself against immediate threats by building his own loyal army and crushing all neighboring forces that could hurt him. Now, to continue his conquests, he had to deal with France. He knew the French king had realized his own mistake too late and would no longer support him. So, Borgia started hunting for new alliances. He began stalling the French while they marched toward Naples to fight the Spanish army besieging Gaeta. Borgia's goal was to lock down his defenses against the French. He would have easily pulled this off if Pope Alexander had lived. That was how he handled the present. But looking to the future, Borgia had one massive fear. He worried that the next pope might be an enemy who would try to steal back everything his father had given him. To prevent this, he executed a four-part strategy. First, he decided to completely wipe out the bloodlines of all the lords he had overthrown, leaving the new pope with no excuse to restore them. Second, he bribed and won over all the Roman nobility, planning to use them to keep the new pope in check. Third, he manipulated the College of Cardinals, packing it with his own loyal allies. Fourth, he aimed to grab so much power before his father died that he could survive the initial shock of a new pope all on his own. When Pope Alexander suddenly died, Borgia had successfully completed 3 of these 4 goals. He had butchered nearly every dispossessed lord he could catch, and very few escaped. He had the Roman nobles in his pocket. And he controlled the largest voting bloc in the College of Cardinals. As for expanding his power, he was on the verge of becoming the absolute master of Tuscany. He already owned Perugia and Piombino, and he had placed Pisa under his protection. The French had just been kicked out of Naples by the Spanish, meaning both sides now desperately needed Borgia's favor. So, with no need to worry about France anymore, he struck directly at Pisa. Immediately after that, Lucca and Siena surrendered to him, driven partly by fear and partly by their hatred for the Florentines. Florence was left completely defenseless. If Borgia had just kept winning the way he was in the year his father died, he would have gained so much sheer power and reputation that he could have stood completely alone. He would never again need to rely on the armies or the fortune of other men, but solely on his own virtue and strength. But Pope Alexander died just 5 years after Borgia first drew his sword. The Pope left his son with only the Romagna fully secured. Everything else was up in the air. Worse, Borgia found himself trapped between 2 massively powerful, hostile armies, and he himself was deathly ill. Yet, the Duke possessed such ruthless boldness and extreme virtue. He understood perfectly how men are won over or destroyed, and the foundations he built in such a short time were incredibly strong. If he had not had those 2 foreign armies breathing down his neck, or if he had just been healthy, he would have survived everything. You can see how strong his foundations were. The entire Romagna waited loyally for him for over a month. Even though he was half dead in Rome, he was perfectly safe. His old enemies, like the Baglioni, the Vitelli, and the Orsini, flooded into the city but could not lay a finger on him. He might not have been able to make his own chosen candidate pope, but he had enough power to ensure his enemies were blocked from the throne. If he had only been in good health when his father died, he would have easily managed the whole crisis. On the very day Pope Julius II was elected, Borgia told me personally that he had planned for every possible scenario regarding his father's death. He had a countermove ready for everything. The one thing he never imagined was that, when his father finally died, he would be on his own deathbed. When I look back at everything the Duke did, I cannot find a single flaw to blame him for. In fact, as I said before, I believe his life is the ultimate blueprint. He should be imitated by anyone who rises to power through the weapons or the fortune of others. Borgia had a relentless spirit and massive ambitions. He could not have played his hand any better. The only things that destroyed his grand designs were his father's sudden death and his own fatal sickness. Therefore, if you are a new prince and you need to secure your state, win friends, and conquer enemies by force or fraud, look to him. If you need to make yourself loved and terrified by your people, and respected and followed by your soldiers, look to him. If you must exterminate those who have the power or the motive to hurt you, if you need to tear down the old system and replace it with a new one, look to Borgia. If you must be ruthless yet gracious, generous yet severe, if you have to wipe out a disloyal army and build a new one, and if you must maintain friendships with kings and princes so they eagerly help you and are terrified to cross you, you will never find a better, more perfect example than the actions of Cesare Borgia. The only real mistake you can blame him for was his role in the election of Pope Julius II. He made a terrible choice. As I mentioned, even if he couldn't force his own candidate into the papacy, he had the veto power to block anyone else. He should never have allowed a cardinal he had previously injured, or one who had reason to fear him, to become pope. Men will hurt you for one of 2 reasons, out of fear or out of hatred. The cardinals he had directly injured included San Pietro ad Vincula, Colonna, San Giorgio, and Ascanio. If any of the others had won, they would have feared him anyway, with the exception of the Cardinal of Rouen and the Spanish cardinals. The Spanish were tied to him through alliances and debt, and Rouen was backed by the immense power of the French kingdom. Therefore, above all else, the Duke should have pushed a Spaniard into the papacy. If he couldn't do that, he should have backed Rouen. He absolutely never should have consented to San Pietro ad Vincula. Anyone who believes that handing out new favors will make powerful men forget old injuries is dangerously foolish. The Duke made a fatal error in this election, and it was the ultimate cause of his complete ruin. Chapter 8. Concerning those who have obtained a principality by wickedness. A man can rise from private life to become a prince in two other ways that cannot be entirely credited to fortune or ability. I must discuss them here, though the second way could be explored more fully in a discussion about republics. The first method is rising to power through wicked and ruthless actions. The second is when a private citizen becomes prince through the favor of his fellow citizens. I will explain the first method using two examples, one ancient and one modern. Without diving deeper into the theory, these two examples will be enough for anyone forced to follow their path. Agathocles the Sicilian became king of Syracuse despite starting from a shockingly low and poor background. He was the son of a potter and lived a brutal, criminal life through every stage of his career. However, he combined his wickedness with such immense physical and mental ability that he joined the military and climbed the ranks to become the praetor of Syracuse. Once securely in that position, he decided to make himself prince. He resolved to use absolute violence to take what the people had willingly granted him, owing nothing to anyone. To do this, he conspired with Hamilcar the Carthaginian, who was fighting in Sicily with his army. One morning, Agathocles called the people and the Senate of Syracuse together, pretending he needed to discuss matters of the Republic. At a given signal, his soldiers murdered all the senators and the wealthiest citizens. With them dead, he seized control of the city and ruled without any resistance from the public. Even though the Carthaginians defeated him twice and eventually placed Syracuse under siege, Agathocles did not just defend his city. He left some of his troops to hold the walls, crossed the sea with the rest, and attacked Africa. This bold move quickly broke the siege of Syracuse. The Carthaginians were pushed to the brink of ruin. They were forced to make peace with Agathocles, settling for control of Africa and leaving Sicily entirely to him. If you examine this man's actions and abilities, you will find very little that can be credited to fortune or luck. As shown above, he did not rely on anyone's favor to gain power. Instead, he rose through the military ranks step by step, enduring 1,000 hardships and deadly risks. Once in power, he held it through bold and dangerous actions. Yet, we cannot call it true virtue or talent to slaughter fellow citizens, betray friends, and live without loyalty, mercy, or religion. These brutal methods can win a man an empire, but they will never win him glory. Still, if you consider Agathocles' courage in facing and escaping danger, along with his mental toughness in enduring and overcoming severe hardships, he stands as tall as any great military commander. Nevertheless, his savage cruelty, his complete lack of humanity, and his endless crimes prevent him from being celebrated among the truly excellent men. In the end, his massive achievements cannot be attributed to either fortune or true virtue. In our own times, during the reign of Pope Alexander VI, there was Oliverotto da Fermo. He was orphaned at a young age and raised by his uncle, Giovanni Fogliani. In his early youth, he was sent to fight under the commander Paolo Vitelli. The goal was for Oliverotto to learn military discipline and achieve a high rank in the army. After Paolo died, Oliverotto fought under Paolo's brother, Vitellozzo. Blessed with intelligence and a strong body and mind, he quickly became the top soldier in his unit. However, he felt it was beneath him to take orders from others. He decided to seize control of his home city, Fermo. He enlisted the help of the Vitelli family and a few local citizens who preferred the enslavement of their city over its freedom. Oliverotto wrote to his uncle Giovanni, saying he had been away for many years and wanted to visit him and see his family estate. He claimed he had fought only for honor. To prove to the citizens of Fermo that his time had not been wasted, he wanted to arrive in a grand fashion. He announced he would bring 100 armed horsemen, consisting of his friends and loyal followers. He begged his uncle to ensure the city welcomed him with great respect. He argued this grand reception would honor not only him, but also Giovanni, the man who had raised him. Giovanni did everything he could for his nephew. He organized a grand welcome from the citizens of Fermo and hosted Oliverotto in his own home. After a few days of setting his sinister trap, Oliverotto threw a lavish banquet. He invited his uncle Giovanni and all the leading men of Fermo. Once the food and entertainment were finished, Oliverotto deliberately steered the conversation towards serious political topics. He spoke about the greatness of Pope Alexander and his ruthless son, Cesare Borgia. When Giovanni and the others began to reply, Oliverotto abruptly stood up. He declared that these sensitive matters needed to be discussed in a more private room. He walked into another chamber, and Giovanni and the city leaders followed him. As soon as they sat down, armed soldiers burst from their hiding spots and slaughtered Giovanni and every last one of the guests. Following this massacre, Oliverotto leaped onto his horse, rode through the town, and besieged the chief magistrate in the palace. Terrified, the people were forced to obey him and establish a new government with Oliverotto as their prince. He systematically murdered anyone who opposed him and could threaten his rule. He enforced strict new civil and military laws. Within a single year in power, he made himself absolutely secure in Fermo and became a terrifying threat to all his neighbors. Taking him down would have been just as difficult as destroying Agathocles. However, Oliverotto allowed himself to be tricked by Cesare Borgia. As I mentioned earlier, Borgia captured him along with the Orsini and Vitelli leaders at Senegalia. Exactly 1 year after murdering his own uncle, Oliverotto was strangled to death alongside his mentor in courage and crime, Vitellozzo. You might wonder how someone like Agathocles could commit endless acts of treachery and unspeakable cruelty, yet live securely in his own country for years. He defended himself against foreign enemies and never faced a rebellion from his own citizens. By contrast, many other rulers have tried to use cruelty but failed to hold on to power even in peacetime, let alone during war. I believe this difference comes down to whether cruelty is used poorly or properly. Cruelty is used properly, if we can ever speak well of evil, when it is executed entirely in a single, swift stroke to secure your power. After that initial blow, a smart ruler stops the bloodshed and focuses on doing what benefits his subjects. Cruelty is used poorly when it starts small but grows and multiplies over time instead of stopping. A prince who uses the first method can eventually stabilize his rule with the help of God and men, just like Agathocles did. But it is absolutely impossible for a prince who uses the second method to stay in power. Therefore, when seizing a state, the conqueror must carefully calculate all the harsh violence he needs to inflict. He must execute all of these cruelties at once so he does not have to repeat them every day. By ending the violence quickly, he can calm the people and eventually win them over with generous benefits. A ruler who fails to do this, whether out of cowardice or bad advice, will be forced to keep a bloody knife in his hand forever. He will never be able to trust his subjects, and they will never feel safe with him because of the constant, repeated abuses. All injuries must be inflicted in one brutal strike, so they are felt less and resented less over time. On the other hand, benefits should be handed out slowly, drop by drop, so the people can savor them longer. Above all, a prince must live among his people in a steady, consistent way. No unexpected turn of events, whether good or bad, should force him to change his behavior. If hard times strike and force your hand, it will be too late to use harsh measures. At the same time, any sudden acts of kindness will not help you either. The people will see your generosity as desperate and forced, and you will earn exactly zero gratitude for it. Chapter 9. Concerning a civil principality. Now we come to the other scenario. This is when a leading citizen becomes the prince of his country, not through wickedness or intolerable violence, but through the favor of his fellow citizens. We can call this a civil principality. You do not need absolute genius or pure luck to achieve this, but rather a lucky kind of shrewdness. I argue that you obtain this kind of principality through the favor of either the people or the nobles. Every city contains these two distinct groups. They exist because the people do not want to be ruled or oppressed by the nobles, while the nobles desperately want to rule and oppress the people. These two opposing desires inevitably lead to one of three results in a city: a principality, a free republic, or total anarchy. A principality is created by either the people or the nobles, depending on which group seizes the opportunity. When the nobles realize they cannot defeat the masses, they start building up the reputation of one of their own. They make him a prince so they can pursue their selfish ambitions while hiding behind his authority. On the other hand, when the people realize they cannot resist the nobles, they elevate one of their own to power. They make him prince so his authority can protect them. A man who gains power with the help of the nobles will have a much harder time keeping it than one who rises through the support of the people. The prince backed by nobles is surrounded by men who consider themselves his equal. Because of this, he can neither rule them nor manage them as he pleases. But a man who comes to power through the favor of the people stands alone. He has very few people around him, if any, who will refuse to obey his commands. Furthermore, it is impossible to satisfy the nobles fairly without injuring others, but you can easily satisfy the people. The goal of the people is far more righteous than that of the nobles. The nobles want to oppress, while the people simply want to avoid oppression. Add to this the fact that a prince can never secure himself against a hostile public because there are simply too many of them. He can, however, secure himself against the nobles because they are few in number. The worst a prince can expect from a hostile public is that they will abandon him. But with hostile nobles, he must fear not only abandonment, but outright rebellion. The nobles are far-seeing and astute. They will always act in time to save themselves, seeking favors from whoever they believe will win. Finally, a prince is forced to live with the exact same common people forever. But he can do perfectly fine without the same nobles, as he has the power to create and destroy them every single day, granting or stripping away their authority whenever it suits him. To make this crystal clear, you should evaluate the nobles in two primary ways. Either they conduct themselves in a way that ties their fate entirely to yours, or they do not. Those who bind themselves to you, provided they are not excessively greedy, should be honored and loved. Those who refuse to bind themselves to you must be handled in two different ways. Sometimes, they do this out of cowardice and a natural lack of courage. In this case, you should make use of them, especially those who offer good advice. This way, they will bring you honor in times of prosperity, and you will not have to fear them in times of adversity. But other times, they refuse to tie themselves to you out of sheer ambition. This is a clear warning sign. It proves they are thinking more about their own interests than yours. A prince must guard against these men and treat them like open enemies, because the moment you face a crisis, they will eagerly help to destroy you. Therefore, a man who becomes prince through the favor of the people must keep them friendly. This is easy to do, since they only ask that he does not oppress them. But a man who becomes prince through the favor of the nobles, against the will of the people, has one ultimate priority. Above everything else, he must seek to win the people over to his side. He can do this easily by taking them under his protection. When men receive good treatment from someone they expected to harm them, they feel a much stronger loyalty to their benefactor. As a result, the people will quickly become even more devoted to him than if he had gained power through their support in the first place. A prince can win their affection in many different ways. These methods change depending on the specific situation, so I cannot lay down fixed rules for them, and I will leave them out. But I will repeat this one absolute necessity: a prince must keep the people friendly, otherwise he will have zero security when disaster strikes. Consider Nobis, the prince of the Spartans. He survived a combined attack from all of Greece and a victorious Roman army. Against overwhelming odds, he defended both his country and his government. To survive this extreme peril, he only needed to secure himself against a small handful of internal enemies. If the general public had been hostile to him, stopping those few enemies would never have been enough. Do not try to argue against my point with that tired old proverb, "He who builds on the people, builds on mud." That saying is only true for a private citizen who relies on the masses, fooling himself into believing the people will rescue him if he is targeted by enemies or magistrates. A man like that will find himself severely disappointed. This is exactly what happened to the Gracchi brothers in Rome, and to Messer Giorgio Scali in Florence. But imagine a true prince who builds his foundation on the people. He is a man who knows how to command and possesses real courage. He does not panic in the face of adversity. He takes the necessary precautions, and through his sheer resolution and energy, he keeps the spirit of the entire population alive. A prince like this will never be betrayed by his people, and the world will see that he has laid his foundations perfectly. Civil principalities face their greatest danger when they transition from a civil government to absolute rule. These absolute princes either rule directly, or they rule through public magistrates. If they rule through magistrates, their government is significantly weaker and more insecure. The prince's power rests entirely on the goodwill of the citizens appointed to those offices. During troubled times, these magistrates can destroy the government with incredible ease, either through secret plotting or open defiance. When the chaos begins, the prince will not have the chance to seize absolute authority. The citizens and subjects are used to taking orders from the magistrates, and they will refuse to obey the prince in the middle of a crisis. In times of doubt, the prince will always face a desperate shortage of men he can trust. A prince in this situation cannot rely on what he sees during quiet, peaceful times. When the state is running smoothly and the citizens need the government, everyone agrees with him. Everyone makes grand promises. When death is a distant thought, they all swear they would die for him. But when times get tough and the state actually needs its citizens, the prince will find almost no one willing to stand by him. This transition to absolute power is incredibly dangerous, especially because you only get to try it once. Therefore, a wise prince must design a system where his citizens will always need the state, and always need him, no matter the circumstances. If he does this, they will remain faithful forever. Chapter 10. Concerning the way in which the strength of all principalities ought to be measured. When evaluating these principalities, you must consider another point. You need to ask whether a prince has enough power to stand on his own in times of need, or if he always has to rely on others for help. To be clear, a prince can support himself if he has enough men and money to raise a strong army and fight anyone who attacks him. On the other hand, a prince must rely on others if he cannot face his enemy in the open field and is forced to hide behind city walls for defense. We have already discussed the first situation, and we will return to it later. As for the second situation, the only advice is to tell these princes to fortify and stockpile supplies in their towns, and to completely abandon defending the surrounding countryside. If a prince builds strong defenses for his town and manages his subjects well, as I have advised before, his enemies will be very cautious about attacking him. Men hate to take on tasks that look difficult. No one thinks it is easy to attack a well-fortified town ruled by a prince who is not hated by his people. Look at the cities of Germany. They are totally free, even though they control very little land around them. They only obey the emperor when it suits them, and they do not fear him or any other nearby powers. This is because they are fortified so heavily that everyone knows taking them by force would be a long, exhausting struggle. They have deep ditches, strong walls, and plenty of artillery. They also keep their public storehouses filled with enough food, drink, and firewood to last a whole year. Furthermore, to keep the people calm and avoid draining the state treasury, these cities always provide work for the public. They employ citizens in the trades that keep the city alive and strong, allowing the people to support themselves. They also highly value military training and have strict laws in place to maintain it. Therefore, a prince with a strong city who has not made himself hated will simply not be attacked. Even if someone is foolish enough to try, the attacker will only be forced to retreat in disgrace. The affairs of this world are unpredictable, making it nearly impossible for an enemy army to sit idle and maintain a siege for a whole year. You might argue that if the people own property outside the city and watch it burn, they will lose patience. You might think a long siege and their own self-interest will make them turn against their prince. To this, I answer that a strong and courageous prince will easily overcome these challenges. He will give his subjects hope that the trouble will not last long. He will remind them of the enemy's cruelty to keep them fearful. At the same time, he will cleverly manage anyone who starts acting too bold or rebellious. Furthermore, the enemy will naturally burn and ruin the countryside the moment they arrive. This happens when the citizen spirits are still hot and they are eager to fight, so the prince has no reason to hesitate or worry. After some time passes and their spirits cool down, the damage is already done and cannot be reversed. At that point, the people will be even more eager to unite with their prince. They will feel he owes them a debt, since their houses were burned and their property was destroyed in his defense. It is human nature to feel bound to others as much by the favors we do for them as by the favors we receive. Therefore, if a wise prince considers everything carefully, he will have no trouble keeping his citizens loyal and determined from the beginning of a siege to the end, as long as he makes sure they have enough food and weapons to defend themselves. Chapter 11. Concerning ecclesiastical principalities. Now it only remains to speak about ecclesiastical principalities. The only difficulties with these states happen before you take them. You can acquire them through ability or fortune, but you can keep them without either. They are sustained by the ancient laws of religion. These religious institutions are so powerful that they keep a prince in power regardless of how he behaves all lives. These are the only princes who have states but do not defend them, and who have subjects but do not rule them. Even though their states are unguarded, they are never taken away. Even though their subjects are not governed, they do not care, and they have neither the desire nor the ability to overthrow their rulers. Therefore, these are the only secure and happy principalities in the world. But since they are upheld by higher powers that the human mind cannot comprehend, I will not speak about them any more. Since they are exalted and maintained by God, only a presumptuous and rash man would dare to discuss them. However, someone might ask me how the Church has achieved such immense worldly power. Before the time of Pope Alexander VI, the major Italian powers cared very little about the temporal power of the Church. Even the smallest barons and lords completely dismissed it. Yet today, a king of France trembles before it. The Church has been able to drive him out of Italy and completely ruin the Venetians. Even though the reasons for this rise to power might be obvious, it is still worth recalling exactly how it happened. Before King Charles VIII of France invaded Italy in 1494, the country was ruled by the Pope, the Venetians, the King of Naples, the Duke of Milan, and the Florentines. These rulers had two main anxieties. First, they wanted to ensure that no foreign army entered Italy. Second, they wanted to prevent any one of them from expanding their territory. The two powers they worried about the most were the Pope and the Venetians. To hold back the Venetians, all the other powers had to unite, just as they did to defend Ferrara. To keep the Pope in check, they used the barons of Rome. These barons were divided into two warring factions, the Orsini and the Colonna. They always had an excuse for causing trouble. Standing armed right under the Pope's nose, they kept the pontificate weak and powerless. Occasionally, a courageous pope like Sixtus IV would come along, but neither his fortune nor his wisdom could free him from these problems. The short lifespan of a pope was the main cause of this weakness. On average, a pope only lived for about 10 years in office, and it was extremely difficult for him to crush even one of these factions. If one pope almost destroyed the Colonna, the next pope would rise up as an enemy of the Orsini and bring the Colonna back to power, yet he would never have enough time to completely destroy the Orsini. This constant infighting was exactly why the worldly power of the pope was respected so little in Italy. Then Pope Alexander VI came into power. Out of all the pontiffs who have ever lived, he was the one who showed exactly how a pope could dominate using both money and armed force. Using Duke Valentino as his instrument, and taking advantage of the French invasion, he accomplished everything I discussed earlier regarding the actions of the Duke. Even though Alexander's true intention was to empower his son the Duke, rather than the Church itself, his actions ultimately contributed to the greatness of the Church. After Alexander died and the Duke was ruined, the Church inherited everything they had built. Pope Julius II came next, and he inherited a very strong Church. It controlled all of the Romagna, the Roman barons were powerless, and Alexander's harsh punishments had wiped out the warring factions. Julius also found new ways to accumulate wealth that had never been practiced before Alexander's time. Julius not only continued these practices, but he improved upon them. He set out to conquer Bologna, destroy the Venetians, and drive the French entirely out of Italy. All of these aggressive campaigns were highly successful. He deserves even more credit because he did everything to strengthen the Church, rather than to enrich any private individual. He also kept the Orsini and Colonna factions strictly within the bounds he found them. Although some of them wanted to stir up trouble, Julius held them down using two firm tactics. First, he terrified them with the immense power of the Church. Second, he refused to let them appoint their own cardinals. The cardinals were the root cause of all the unrest between them. Whenever these factions have their own cardinals, they never stay quiet for long. Cardinals foster the factions both inside and outside of Rome, and the barons are forced to defend them. In this way, the ambitions of religious prelates always cause disorders and riots among the barons. Thanks to these ruthless and calculating strategies, His Holiness Pope Leo X inherited a supremely powerful pontificate. Since his predecessors made the Church great through force of arms, we can only hope that Leo will make it even greater and more deeply respected through his goodness and his infinite other virtues.